Well, unfortunately, all three of our internal valve caps were unable to shut off the flow of fuel from our external fuel tank. So now we're going to try the brass shutoff valve external entry into the cap. So I've placed some Teflon tape on my quick disconnect. I'm going to install that in this cap, and then we'll give this one a try. Okay, so we've tested all three of our fuel caps that have the internal fuel shutoff and venting valves, and all three of them failed to shut off the flow of fuel from the external tank. It was just too much pressure to get a good seal for that little aluminum ball against the rubber O-ring. So now we have mounted our quick disconnect fitting on the top of the fuel cap, and we're going to try our other system here with the external brass fitting. So let's see how this one works. Okay, we're connected, and so far so good. We got just a little bit of fuel around the top of the cap there that came out from pushing the quick disconnect into the fuel line, but so far our little valve seems to be working just fine. So what I did there as a little test was I pumped the squeeze bulb several times to pressurize the line, and I was able to generate enough pressure to get just a little bit of seepage out of the valve. But I think I was just overpowering the valve with extra pressure that it would not normally have under a siphon situation. So I think once we relieve that extra pressure, I think it's going to shut off real nicely. And it's just a real easy, slow little seep here, even under that pressure. So I'm going to start the generator and see what we get. Well, this is a very happy story indeed. I had overpressurized the tank by squeezing the squeeze bulb, and as soon as I gave a few cranks on the generator and it started up, it relieved that pressure, and that overpressurization went away right away. You can see a little bit of bubbling left in that valve there, but it looks like it might be doing its job. Let's see if it's going to overflow or not. So far it's not overflowing, it's just kind of bubbling. So I'm very excited here. We might have solved the problem. So I'm going to use the other cap to set up an overnight test if this looks like it's going to be successful. Well, fellas, I've let the generator run for several minutes here, and we kind of reached a stable situation. So what's happening is the valve is not quite sealing off. You can see my finger's wet, the top of the cap is wet, and there's a little bit of dribble down the sides of the generator. So it's kind of de minimis in a way, you know. I mean, this is wet, and what's happening is the valve is filling up to the top and then just kind of seeping over, and it's not much, but it's you know, we're definitely getting a little fuel leakage out the top of the valve. So we'll continue on from here. So this is interesting that as the generator continues to run, we get these bubbles that form in the top of the valve. I think it's probably coming from the action of the valve itself venting. As fuel is running down and it's seeking a vent, it's letting air come up in there, and then the external fuel tank siphons fuel in there that gets you know, it gets a little fuel up at the top of the valve before the ball can shut off, and so you get this little super aerated bubbling fuel in the top of the shutoff valve. Okay, so we got two of these caps with the brass shutoff valves in them, so we might as well test both both prototypes. So I've wrapped my Teflon tape around the end of my second quick disconnect fitting. I'm going to screw that into this cap and then go fit that to our other generator, and we're going to hook up both generators in parallel to a heater and run them overnight to make sure that the scientific part of the concept works. Okay, so we're going to test our second MERGS fuel cap with the brass fitting on top, just to make sure that we're good to go there. So this is our second generator. You can see it's almost full to the top on the fuel, and I've already put the Teflon tape on the quick disconnect fitting. I'm screwing that down onto the generator now, our second generator, and that's nice and snug. So we will take our second tank and plug it in. There, we got a good snap, and so far nothing has happened. I'm going to give the squeeze pump, a little squeeze bulb, a couple of pumps there to make sure that we've got fuel siphoning from this external tank down into this generator. And it's starting to feel a little tight. Okay, that should. There we go. And we got our siphon started. You can see it bubbled a little bit, and then it looked like the fuel shutoff valve worked, like it shut it off. So I'm going to crank these up. I've got both of the generators hooked up in parallel with those red and black cords, and I'm going to, they've both got their own external fuel tanks, and both external fuel tanks are almost full to the top. So when we come back to check them later, we'll be able to check its level. Well, you can see this one is right there. So just about even with the top of the part of the tank where the filler cap is, and same right here. So both of those tanks are just about as full as they can be, and we're going to connect this heater that I'm going to put on a high setting to provide a load for both of the generators, so they will need to consume their internal fuel, and then we hope they will consume their external fuel. So that's our test. So this is our second fuel cap, and I just started the generator, turned on the electronic speed control, and you can see it's essentially doing exactly what the other one did. The valve seems to be popping off. It fills up with gas, and then shuts itself off, and then I'm hoping that it's also providing a vent to the internal tank. So far the top of this cap is pretty dry. There's just a little bit where it's kind of gurgled over the top of the valve, and so far it seems to be doing a pretty good job of shutting off the fuel flow from the external tank. We just have that little thimble full of fuel in the valve itself. Okay, so both of the generators are running now. They're both behaving exactly the same. Both of them have, well, this one has a little bit more aerated, more air in the top of its valve, and it actually seems to be a little wetter. Like it might be seeping just a little bit more than the second one. The second one, the valve itself is full of fuel, but you can see there's just a little wetness on the cap. It's not really burbling over as much as this one on the right is. But that's what we got. So we'll come over to our heater and we'll put it on 900 watts and crank it up. So you heard both generators. The electronic speed controls reacted to that. They loaded up both generators to take that load. That's going to be a pretty substantial load. So I'm going to let that run and come back and check on it later, and hopefully it will burn all the fuel out of the internal tanks and then burn the fuel from the external tanks, which are properly vented with their vents, and we'll just see what we have at the end of our test. There's one more quick thing I wanted to document. It might be a little hard to hear because I've got both generators under load powering that heater, so they're running pretty fast, but I just want to show that both of the external tanks are pretty much full. So here's the one going to the second cap. You can see fuel levels almost all the way up to the top of the filler neck. And on the first tank, let's go to the first cap that we tested. You can see it's like right at the bottom of the filler neck from when we were running that earlier. So that's what we're starting with, and of course the internal tanks are both completely full. So beginning the test at it's 3:30 on the 16th of September. That's a Wednesday in 2020. It's like 3:35 on the 16th, and I just wanted to show that I cranked the rheostat back to 2. It's still on 1500 watts, so both of the buttons are down, both the 600 on the left and the 900 on the right. So it's pulling 1500 watts, and I just dialed it back to 2 because it was sort of loud with it cranked all the way up to 9. Here, I'll show you. And I was just afraid it would be a nuisance to my neighbors here at the Rock Hill Airport. So I don't think that's too noisy sitting out here in the open. That's probably not going to bother anybody. But that's why I dialed it back, take a little load off, and run the generators a little slower so that they're not making as much noise. Hey, just another quick notation here. This is interesting. This is the first cap, the number 1 cap that I was testing, and it looks like it has gone into the vent mode, and that little thimble of fuel that was trapped on top there has disappeared back down into the cap, and it looks like it's just venting the internal fuel right now. Whereas the second one that hasn't been going as long, it's doing what the first one was earlier. It's got that aerated thimble full of fuel trapped in the top of the valve. But I think when it goes into vent mode, that's probably going to go away and do like this one did. So that's pretty interesting. Also, now that this cap has gone into the vent mode on its valve, you can see the cap is dry. There's no fuel down in the little holder ring or anything like that, so the cap's nice and dry. So this is interesting. This is the same number 1 cap valve that was venting earlier, and everything was perfectly dry, and now it looks like it has started siphoning again. So it's overflowing just a little bit. We've got just a little seepage going over the sides there to where a little bit of fuel gets past the valve before the valve shuts off, and you can see the little foaming there at the top of the valve. So this is interesting. I'm just going to make a note of it. The generators have been running about an hour or so now, and this is the first one, the number 1, and you can see it's still bubbling in its valve, and it's wet. It's not, running real running fuel, but it is wet. And the other cap over there, you can see it's dry. So it seems to be doing a better job of shutting off the overflow when the fuel siphons from the external tank into the generator. So we'll see how it turns out. Okay, so it's about 10:40 on Thursday, the 17th of September, 2020, and we are on our way over to check on our generator test that should have run all night last night. We're getting quite a bit of rain here from Hurricane Sally that hit down on the Gulf Coast, so that'll also be an interesting part of the test that wasn't really scripted, but it'll be interesting to know if the rain interfered with the shutoff valves there at all, if it caused any rain to get down into the generators, or if that little thimble full of fuel that was kind of bubbling up into the shutoff valves kind of insulated that and caused any rain to run off. So we'll know in a minute. Well, that's a good sign. I think I can hear the generators running. I just shut off the car here, the Tahoe, and I think I can hear the generators still running. Well, this is really fascinating. One of the generators, the first one that I checked, is still running. It's humming away, and its external fuel tank is almost depleted. So it's been running all night and drawing fuel off of the external tank. So it worked perfectly. The other one, I'm gonna try to show. It looks like it burned some fuel. The other generator is stopped. It didn't run all night. And if you can see, the fuel is down maybe an inch or two. So it looks like it ran for a while on the external fuel. And then for some reason it quit running. So I'm going to pull off the cap. And I think what we're going to find is that the valve failed to vent the internal fuel. I think we're going to find a vacuum space in there with some internal fuel left in the generator. Just going to note, when I pulled the fuel line off of this generator, the fuel came out of the line, so it had a good siphon going. There was fuel in the line, and I also noted that the valve was dry. It didn't have fuel up in the top of the valve. So now I'm going to pull the cap off and see what we got. So there's our answer. The fuel burned down when I left yesterday. It was up at the very top of the filler neck, and now it's down just below that red ring. So it burned down, you know, about 2 inches or so. And I'm sure what happened was the same thing that happened before. It developed a vacuum, and that starved the carburetor. So the generator died. Well, I tried to take a photo, but that's probably not going to come out because it's just clear at the red tank. But the point is, this external tank is pretty much empty. It's almost, there's just a fraction of fuel left in the external tank. So it burned almost all the fuel out of this external tank. It's still running right now. Probably it might still be siphoning a little bit out of the external tank, but it's probably just using up what's in the internal tank. And also I wanted to notice that the valve is dry. It doesn't have that fuel bubbling up in it like it had when I left yesterday. There's water there, so we got an unintentional test because of Hurricane Sally that we know even if you leave this thing out in pouring rain, it will still operate. So the heater is still going. You can see the two red lights on both heating elements. I just touched it a minute ago. It's very hot to the touch. So it's still running and putting off heat and putting a load on the generator, and the generator is still just plugging along. So I'm going to let it keep going and come back and check on it later and see how many hours that generator will carry that load. Well, that was really pretty fascinating. At least we proved that the science works behind it. That one generator has run all night long and has consumed all the fuel in its external tank, and it's still powering that heater. So I don't know why the valve failed on the other one, but at least we did prove that the concept works. That generator has operated, probably about 20 hours now, and all burned up all the fuel in the external tank. So it's almost 11 o'clock in the morning now. So I'll come back in a few hours and check and see how long that generator continues to run. I'm going to do my talking in the car here so it's not so noisy and we're not out in the rain and trying to talk over the generator. So the thought occurred to me after I went over to my hangar for a few minutes that maybe the reason that other generator didn't keep running all night was maybe the rain killed it. Maybe enough water got in that valve so that when it tried to vent, it wasn't able to vent because it had water in the valve, and that prevented the inside from venting, and that's what killed the generator. So it's still raining like crazy here from Hurricane Sally, so I've got the ready-made conditions to retest it. So I've cut a slot in this old peanut jar, and I'm going to place that over the cap so that rain can't get to the vent, and I'm going to crank up that generator and try it again. So that's what our new test is going to be. Okay, so I've cranked up this generator again. I put the peanut jar over the top. I removed the fuel line earlier and took the cap off, so any vacuum that was there was broken. So I put the cap back on, re-established the fuel line, so it's got a good siphon going, and it's running, connected in parallel to the other generator. And I made sure that this fuel cap on the tank that's going to the second generator is actually loose to make sure there's no problem with the vent. The vent was open on this cap, but just to make sure there's no problem, the cap is just slightly on there, so it's definitely got a good vent. All of the fuel is expended out of the original external cap over there, and the first generator is still running, so I don't know how much fuel is left in that internal generator, but it's about 20 minutes after 11 now, and it's still running. Of course, now the second generator is online to help carry the load, so that'll probably make it run a little bit longer. So we'll come back in a few hours and check on it and see if putting a waterproof cap over the valve makes that second generator work any better. Well, now this is a little baffling. It's now 11:45. I just swung back by to see what we had, and my number one generator that ran all night, we know it was running a half hour ago, it has died now. All the fuel is out of its external tank, and I fully expected the internal tank to be empty when I took the cap off, but when I took the cap off, it looks like there's still a significant amount of fuel in the internal tank. So apparently the vent valve failed after working all night. Once it ran out of external fuel, for some reason it failed to vent the internal tank, and it developed a vacuum, and it shut down with still a considerable amount of fuel left in the internal tank. So what I did was took the cap off of this number one generator that still had fuel in the internal tank, even though it had exhausted all the fuel in the external tank. So that would have broken any vacuum. And then I put the cap back on and started it again. By the way, there was a significant decrease in engine speed of the other generator when this generator came online. So they're definitely sharing the load on that 1500 watt heater that's still sitting out here in the rain running. So he cranked right up, one pull. There's nothing wrong with the generator that caused it to die or anything like that. And so he cranked up again, it's sharing the load, it's running. It's connected to the external fuel tank just to make sure no water gets in there, but it's strictly running on internal fuel. So we'll let that run a while and come back and check on it. Okay, so it's almost 4:30 on Thursday the 17th of September. I'm returning to my test site here, and when I came up, neither generator was running, and it seems like it's not getting the vent. So this is the number two, although it does seem like it burned some gas out of the external tank. It's hard to see in there, but about half the gas is gone out of the internal tank. But when we look in the internal tank, it's almost full, so it's down about like it was before. when it would run for a while and then create a vacuum because it wasn't getting a vent. So I don't believe that shutoff valve is working as a vent. It's just not giving it a vent. So the same thing is true over here. This is the generator that did run all night, consumed all the fuel in the external tank, but when I pull the cap off, you can see same type of thing, almost exactly the same level of gas in there. So there's plenty of fuel in the internal tank, and I'm sure that the reason that it stopped running was it just couldn't find a vent. So that's my number one generator again. I pulled the cap off to break the vacuum and then gave the starter a tug, and it just cranked right up. So I'm sure it died because it could not find a vent for the internal tank. So just to document the number two generator, same thing. I pulled the cap off, break the vacuum, and put it back on, gave the handle a tug, and it just cranked right up. So I'm sure that the reason that it died with plenty of fuel in the internal tank was because it lacked a vent, and placing that plastic cap over it made no difference at all. So it wasn't because of the rain, it was because that valve was not venting properly. Okay, it's Friday the 18th of September, about 9 o'clock in the morning. I'm going to just go ahead and kill the generator, but I went ahead and cranked it up just to show that it would. So this is what happened overnight. The number one generator, as you recall, had burned up all of its external fuel there, running around 20 hours or so, and I cranked it up again just to see if it would burn its internal fuel, and apparently it burned quite a bit of it, not all of it, but excuse me, so we look down in there, there's probably, I don't know, a quart left. So it's kind of baffling why it would burn about 3/4 of its fuel and then stop before it burned it all. The story on number two is number two this time burned its external fuel. So it must have run pretty much all night, but then as soon as it consumed all of the external fuel and switched over to its internal fuel, you can see it's almost full. So I think it's the same thing. It must have failed to get a vent for the internal tank, and it died. So that's the end of our test results for our fuel tank prototypes.